Margaret Ellison had grown used to the kind of silence that didn't simply fill a room. It pressed against it, sinking into walls, seeping beneath doors, settling over her like a weight she carried from dawn to dusk. In the 2 years since her husband Daniel passed away, the world had not only become quieter, it had become smaller, shrinking to the boundaries of her aging cottage and the trembling edges of her own heart. She moved through her days like a shadow, drifting from one memory to another, never fully arriving in the present, never fully willing to let the past loosen its grip. The house that once echoed with footsteps, laughter, the soft hum of Daniel's singing, and the gentle murmur of late-night conversations now sat still, as though it too were mourning. And yet, even in that stillness, she was never truly alone. Jasper, her loyal service dog, followed her like a guardian stitched into every step she took. He was a large golden retriever with a calm, comforting presence. One of those animals whose eyes seemed to hold more understanding than most people she'd met. His fur had darkened slightly with age, but he moved with a steady confidence, his tail swishing softly like a constant reminder that life hadn't completely abandoned her. Jasper had been Daniel's idea, a companion they both believed Margaret needed as the years began to weigh heavier on her bones and her balance grew less steady. Back then, she had resisted, insisting she could manage. But Jasper proved himself quickly. Becoming more than a helper, he became an anchor. Every morning, as the pale sunlight slipped through the curtains, Jasper would come to her bedside, nudging her gently until she stirred. Some days she wasn't ready to face the world, but Jasper never gave up. He would rest his head on the mattress, his warm breath on her hand, until she whispered, "All right, boy, I'm getting up." He understood her grief in a way she couldn't explain. When she cried in the quiet hours of the night, he would rest his chin on her lap, unmoving except to lift his eyes toward her as if reminding her she wasn't as alone as she felt. The cottage wore its age like an old coat, weathered, patched, and softened by time. The wooden floors creaked differently now that only one set of human footsteps crossed them. The walls still held the framed photographs of adventures she and Daniel once shared. Road trips in their 20s, birthdays, anniversaries, snapshots of moments that felt eternal back then, but now stood like silent witnesses to a life that had slipped too quickly into memory. Dust gathered on shelves she once cleaned every Saturday morning when Daniel would tease her for being unable to sit still. She didn't bother as much now. The dust never complained, and the house didn't mind. Outside, the once thriving garden was slowly surrendering to nature's wildness. Daniel had loved tending to it, kneeling in the soil with his sleeves rolled up, humming softly as he planted rose bushes and trimmed ivy. Now the roses grew untamed, spilling over the walkway, while ivy crept boldly up the walls, reaching toward the windows as though curious about the woman lingering behind them. Margaret often paused at the doorway, looking at the garden with a painful mixture of longing and exhaustion. She could almost hear Daniel's voice, warm and teasing, telling her to grab her gloves and help him pull weeds. But she hadn't stepped outside to garden since the day he fell ill. Jasper sensed those moments when her breath hitched, when she lingered too long in a memory, when she drifted into the deep, unreachable waters of grief. He would nudge her knee, lick her hand, or simply sit beside her with a watchful stillness. He was the last piece of Daniel she felt she still had, a living reminder of her husband's thoughtfulness and love. Life carried on with a predictable rhythm. Quiet breakfasts at the small kitchen table, afternoons spent reading old letters or staring absently at the television, evenings wrapped in the soft glow of a lamp as she sipped tea that often grew cold before she even tasted it. Jasper rarely left her side, unless it was to fetch something or alert her when she forgot to take her medication. He understood routine. He understood necessity. But on one particular morning, something shifted. Margaret noticed it immediately. Jasper wasn't behaving as he usually did. Instead of waiting patiently at her bedside, he paced the hallway, claws tapping lightly on the worn wooden floor. His head was low, nose pressed to the ground as he moved back and forth with growing urgency. At first, she thought maybe he had misplaced one of his toys or smelled a mouse. "Jasper," she called softly, her voice still raspy from sleep. "Come here, boy." But he didn't. Instead, he turned his head toward her, eyes intense, an intensity that unsettled her. He let out a low, insistent whine before returning to the same spot near the coat closet where the wallpaper met an old section of baseboard. She hadn't paid that wall much attention in years, but Jasper pressed his snout against it with purposeful sniffing, then scratched lightly with his paw, tail stiff rather than wagging. Margaret frowned, pushing herself up with her cane. Every movement felt deliberate these days, every step a negotiation with her aching joints. "What are you doing, Jasper?" she murmured as she approached, expecting him to reveal a trapped insect, or at worst a small hole chewed by critters. But when she reached him, he stepped back and looked at her with an expression that made her heart tighten, an expression too knowing, too expectant. She placed a hand on the wall, intending only to humor him, but then her fingers caught something unexpected, an edge, a faint, thin line running along the baseboard, something she had never noticed despite passing the spot thousands of times. She pressed slightly, and the wood shifted almost imperceptibly. Her breath halted. Jasper whined again, ears perked. "What on earth?" she whispered. She knelt slowly, painfully, to inspect the seam more closely. Her fingers traced it, feeling the irregular outline of a panel that didn't belong. A hidden space, a secret built into the walls of a house she thought she knew as well as her own heartbeat. Jasper looked at her, eyes bright, tail lifting just slightly as though he knew he had found something important. Something Daniel had left behind. And Margaret felt her pulse quicken for the first time in a very, very long while. Margaret hesitated before touching the panel again. Her hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly, as though afraid that whatever she uncovered might break the fragile balance she had maintained since Daniel's passing. Jasper stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. He nudged her elbow gently, urging her on. It was strange. He had never acted this insistent before. For a moment, she wondered if dogs could sense things humans weren't ready to face, if somehow Jasper understood that whatever lay behind this hidden panel wasn't just an object, but a truth waiting to be revealed. With a slow breath, she pressed again. The wood shifted, this time more noticeably, and she realized the panel hadn't been sealed permanently. It had simply blended perfectly into the molding. Perhaps Daniel had crafted it himself. He had always been meticulous with his carpentry, able to hide seams and joints so cleanly that even trained eyes sometimes missed them. She pushed gently, and with a soft click, the panel popped forward, swinging open like the small door of a forgotten cabinet. Inside, the space was dark, and the dust that drifted out made her cough lightly. Jasper lowered his head and sniffed, tail wagging once with excitement, before he sat back politely, letting Margaret explore. She leaned forward, grateful for the way Jasper steadied her as she shifted her weight. Her hand reached inside, brushing against something cold and metallic. The object was wedged tightly, as though placed with intention. She grasped it carefully and pulled. A small metal box emerged into the light. It was old, older than she expected, with corners softened from time and a thin layer of dust clinging to its surface. The lid bore a faint engravement that made her breath catch, Daniel's initials, D.E. Margaret felt her eyes sting immediately. She hadn't seen those initials carved by his hand since he made her a jewelry box for their 25th anniversary. Her fingers traced the lettering, feeling the grooves where his tools had cut into the metal. A sob rose unexpectedly in her chest, and she forced herself to steady her breathing. "What did you find for me, boy?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Jasper rested his head against her shoulder, as though grounding her in the present moment. She carried the box to the living room, sitting slowly in her old armchair, the one with faded fabric and worn armrests from decades of use. It felt right to open the box here, in the spot where she and Daniel had spent countless evenings reading, talking, and dozing off together while the fireplace crackled softly. Jasper sat at her feet, eyes fixed on the box with unnerving attentiveness. The latch resisted at first. She used her thumb to push harder, and it slowly gave way with a rusty snap. The lid lifted, revealing a stack of envelopes bound neatly with twine. Her breath halted as she recognized the handwriting, the soft, slanted script that had written her birthday cards, grocery lists, the tiny notes he used to tuck into her coat pocket whenever she had a difficult day. "You can do this. I believe in you." She ran her thumb along the top envelope, her heart twisting painfully. The name on the first letter was hers. "My dearest Margaret." Her tears fell before she even opened it. Her fingers trembled, but she managed to tear the flap gently and unfold the paper. Daniel's handwriting covered the page in soft blue ink, slightly smudged in places, as though he had paused frequently while writing. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "it means the day I feared most has come, and I'm no longer beside you in the way I always hoped to be." Margaret pressed the letter to her chest for a moment, unable to continue. Jasper sensed her sorrow and gently placed a paw on her knee. She stroked his fur, grounding herself before reading on. "I didn't want to burden you with my worries. I didn't want you to watch me fear what was happening to my body. I wanted to spend our days laughing, remembering, and loving the way we always have. So I began writing these letters. I didn't know if I'd ever hide them, or if I'd be brave enough to tell you they existed. But I decided if Jasper found them for you, then it means you needed them, and I'm grateful he guided you." Margaret covered her mouth, fighting the sob threatening to escape. Daniel continued, "You've given me a life richer than anything I ever imagined. You made our house a home, our days an adventure, and my heart a place of peace. I want you to have these letters because I don't want the story of us to end with me. I want you to remember our joy, our quiet moments, and everything in between." She read each word as though it were air she desperately needed. Her fingers traced the ink, the curve of each letter. It felt like reaching through time and touching him again. The pain of his absence didn't fade, but somehow it intertwined with gratitude. Gratitude that he had loved her so deeply, so thoughtfully, that he had left behind pieces of himself for her to find. Jasper nudged the box gently with his nose, as though telling her there was more. And there was. Beneath the first letter, she found another envelope, then another, thick ones, thin ones, some sealed, others loosely folded. Some addressed to her, others labeled with dates, anniversaries, holidays that had passed or would come long after he was gone. One envelope simply said, "Open on a day you feel like you can't go on." Margaret's tears blurred her vision until the letters melted into soft blue lines. She pressed her palm over her heart, feeling it ache and swell all at once. Jasper placed his head on her lap, looking up at her with quiet understanding. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, minutes, hours, maybe the entire afternoon, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Jasper hadn't stumbled onto the hidden panel by accident. Daniel had chosen this dog for a reason. He had known Jasper would protect her, guide her, and one day lead her to the truth he couldn't say aloud. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the faintest flicker of something warm spreading through her chest, something like hope, or healing, or a doorway opening gently inside her grief. The letters were only the beginning. Margaret woke the next morning with the metal box still resting on the table beside her armchair, as though it had stayed awake through the night watching over her. She had fallen asleep there, Jasper curled protectively at her feet, the last letter she read resting loosely in her hand. The house felt different now. Not louder, not brighter, but alive, like someone had lit a candle in a room she had forgotten existed. For the first time in years, she didn't wake with dread or heaviness. Instead, she woke with a strange mixture of anticipation and fear. She wasn't sure which feeling was stronger. Jasper lifted his head the moment her eyes opened, tail thumping gently against the rug. He nudged her leg, urging her to stand, to face the day. She smiled weakly. "I know," she murmured, brushing his soft ears. "We have more to read." But before she opened another letter, she walked into the kitchen and brewed coffee the way Daniel used to make it, strong, with a splash of cream and a spoonful of honey. She hadn't made it that way since he passed. She didn't know why. Maybe she thought it would hurt too much, or maybe she believed drinking coffee without him was somehow a betrayal. Yet, as she took the first sip, warmth spread through her like a memory she could taste, a memory that held no pain this time, only comfort. She carried the mug into the living room, where Jasper sat waiting beside the box. His eyes followed her every movement, as though he understood the importance of what came next. She took her seat, opened the box again, and gently lifted the next envelope. This one was labeled, "Our First Winter Together." She opened it slowly, savoring the delicate tear of the paper. Inside was a letter filled with Daniel's handwriting that danced across the page in soft, familiar strokes. "Do you remember that winter?" the letter began. "The heater broke, and we spent 3 days bundled in blankets, wrapped around each other like two stubborn birds refusing to migrate. We burned candles in every room and pretended the flickering shadows were our fireplace. You laughed more in those 3 days than I'd heard in years. I wanted to fix the heater, but seeing you smile beside me, I never hurried." Margaret chuckled through a tear. She remembered that winter vividly. The frozen windows, the endless layers of socks, the way Daniel had insisted they sleep in the living room to conserve warmth, though she knew he simply wanted an excuse to hold her all night. Back then, problems had felt smaller, softer, even the cold somehow warmer by his side. She folded the letter gently and placed it on her lap, letting herself sink deeper into the memory until Jasper nudged her again, not impatiently, but as though urging her not to stop. There was more to uncover. The next envelope was labeled with no words, only a date from many years ago. When she opened it, a small photograph slipped out, falling to her lap. The image startled her. It was a picture of her standing in the garden during their first year in the house, sunlight catching her hair as she held a basket of freshly picked tomatoes. Daniel had loved that photo. He used to say it was the moment he realized the house had finally become a home because she looked so happy in it. Behind the photo was a shorter note. "I never showed you this picture because it made my heart ache in the best way. You were glowing that day. I wanted to keep that moment just for myself, a quiet reminder that even the simplest days with you were extraordinary." Margaret pressed the photo to her chest. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, voice trembling. The next letter was heavier, thicker, as though Daniel had poured even more of himself into it. Its envelope was worn along the edges, the paper inside filled to the margins. As she read, she felt the weight of his thoughts, the depth of his love, and the quiet fear he must have carried at the end. "I knew the day would come when you would be left in this old house without me," he wrote. "But I also knew you were stronger than you ever believed. You've always seen yourself as fragile, delicate, but you aren't. You rebuilt your life after your father died. You stood by me when I lost my job. You held our family together through every storm. You are the strongest person I have ever known." Tears slid down her cheeks as she read his words. No one had called her strong in years. She hadn't felt strong in years. She had felt like a cracked vase someone kept forgetting to throw away. But Daniel hadn't forgotten. He hadn't doubted her. Even in his last days, he believed in her more than she believed in herself. "If you feel lost, listen to Jasper. He understands things we can't. I didn't choose him for you lightly. I chose him because he listens with a heart that sees beyond grief. He will show you things I never could. When he leads you somewhere, follow him. When he insists on something, trust him. And when he brings you to something hidden, know that I put it there only because I wanted you to find it." Margaret froze. Jasper lifted his head sharply, as though he knew those words were meant for this moment. She looked down at him. "You knew," she whispered. Jasper wagged his tail once, softly, as if confirming what she already suspected deep in her bones. Daniel hadn't just written letters. He had planned this. He had built this hidden panel. He had chosen Jasper not just to comfort her, but to guide her, not randomly, but purposefully. Her pulse quickened. She reached back into the box, digging beneath the letters. Her fingers brushed something hard, wrapped in cloth. She pulled it out slowly. The cloth was old, worn thin, the color faded from years hidden in darkness. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was an item she had not seen in decades, Daniel's old journal. The one he kept only for himself. The one he never let anyone read. She clutched it to her chest as tears streamed down her face. Jasper pressed his head into her knee, offering silent support. The letters had brought her memories. But the journal would bring her truths. Truths Daniel had never spoken aloud. Truths Jasper had known she was meant to find. And as Margaret opened the first page, the world around her seemed to shift, quietly, gently, but undeniably, into something new. Something about to change everything she thought she knew about her husband, her home, and the life she believed she had already fully lived. Margaret sat completely still, the letter trembling faintly between her fingers, as though the paper itself hummed with the weight of years she had never lived but somehow felt. The house seemed to fold inward around her, every familiar creak and echo holding its breath. Even the wind outside the window paused in its moan, as if it too hovered in anticipation of what she would do next. Bailey rested his chin on her knee, sensing that the quiet surrounding them was not a natural silence, but the thin, fragile hush of a heart remembering how to break. She looked down at him, her chest heavy. He had done what no one else could. He had found a voice she thought the world had long since stolen from her. She slid her hand across his head and whispered a thank you so soft she wasn't sure if even she heard it. She stood slowly and walked toward the old hallway, the walls lined with pictures of a life that now felt like a story retold through fog. She paused at the framed photo of her and Thomas on the pier, the day he'd come home from deployment for the final time. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He was just wearing a smile that softened the stern lines the military had etched into him. Her younger self leaned into him, trusting him with the ease of someone who believed she'd spend forever in that moment. She touched the glass and felt the chill seep into her fingers. She wondered how many moments like that had slipped past her unnoticed, while she had been too busy grieving the ones she could never get back. She returned to the couch, unfolding the letter again with the same caution one uses to open a wound that never healed right. The handwriting was undeniably his, strong yet slanted, as though he wrote while the world hurried him along. The date at the top stunned her. It was the day before his final mission. This was his last message, written while he still believed he might come home again. She imagined him at a small wooden desk, maybe under a lone flickering light, writing each word with the knowledge that he might not get another chance to say what mattered. She pictured the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he didn't know how to begin, the way he tapped the pen when he needed courage, the way he would whisper her name under his breath just to steady himself. Her eyes drifted to the living room window where the sun began to set, smearing the sky in streaks of orange and gold. The world outside looked peaceful, the kind of peaceful Thomas always said he fought for. She let the fading light wash over her as she finally sank deeper into the words he had left behind. She read them again, this time slower, absorbing not just the sentences but the breath between them, the pauses where she could almost hear his voice saying her name. He hadn't written it to cause pain. He had written it because he loved her in a way that refused to die, even when he did. Bailey shifted beside her, nudging her hand insistently as if reminding her that she wasn't as alone as she had convinced herself. She rubbed his neck and felt, for the first time in years, the faintest warmth crack through the hard shell of sorrow she had wrapped around herself. She realized then that her grief had become a cage, one she had lived inside for so long that she forgot she could ever open the door. But now, with this letter, with Bailey's unwavering presence, that door suddenly felt less locked. The words in the letter began to echo in her mind, looping until they stitched themselves into her thoughts. "You're stronger than you believe. Live for the both of us." There was something almost unbearable about the idea that Thomas had spent his final hours thinking about how she might one day survive without him. That he had cared not about being remembered as a soldier, but being remembered as her husband. She pressed the letter against her chest as if she could pull him back into her heartbeat. She stood once more, this time with a steadiness she hadn't felt earlier. She walked into Thomas's old study, once his sanctuary, now a room she rarely entered. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled like time left untouched. She pushed open the curtains, letting a wash of fading sunlight pour over the desk, illuminating the outlines of the life he hadn't finished living. She placed the letter gently on the desk, as though returning something sacred to its rightful altar. Her hands traced the spine of his old journals, the ones he never let her read because he said they were filled with half-formed thoughts and clumsy feelings he never found proper words for. She wondered if he had written about her in them, about fears he didn't want to burden her with, or hopes he didn't dare voice. She thought about opening them now, but decided against it. It wasn't time. The letter was enough, for tonight, for this fragile moment when grief and love intertwined so tightly they felt nearly indistinguishable. She closed the study door softly behind her and returned to the living room where Bailey waited with patient eyes. She knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around his warm body. She held him like someone holding a lifeline, and maybe she was. For months he had nudged her toward life when she tried to sink deeper into the past. Now she understood that he had been preparing her for this moment all along. With a long, steady breath, she stood and walked to the kitchen, filling a kettle with water. The simple act felt grounding, like rediscovering the rhythm of being alive. She lit the stove, watched the flame bloom, and let its small warmth settle her heart. She kept seeing Thomas's handwriting in her mind, not as a source of pain, but as a bridge, something that connected who she had been with who she still could be. When the kettle finally whistled, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat beside Bailey again. She looked at him, really looked, and whispered, "You brought him back to me." Bailey's ears twitched, and he nudged her hand again, as though acknowledging his part in all of this. The house no longer felt empty. It felt like a place where love had lived, left, and somehow found its way home again. A quiet dawn unfolded the next morning, soft and pale, the kind of morning where the world seemed to rise slowly so it wouldn't startle anyone still mending. Margaret sat awake long before the sun crept over the horizon. Bailey curled at her feet, his steady breathing anchoring her in a place she hadn't felt anchored to in a very long time. The letter lay on the table beside her, a fragile piece of the past now stitched into her present. She traced its edge absently, as though reacquainting herself with a part of her heart she had forgotten she still possessed. It didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like sunlight breaking through a room that had been shut for too many years. She watched the sky shift from a bluish gray to the soft hues of rose and gold, the light slipping slowly across the walls of her living room. She realized with a quiet sense of awe that she hadn't watched a sunrise on purpose since Thomas passed. For years, she woke up because the day demanded it, not because anything in her wanted to meet the morning. But today felt different, not lighter, not easier, but somehow fuller. She could breathe in a way that didn't feel like a battle. Bailey stretched and nudged against her leg, his tail thumping the floor in a steady rhythm. She reached down to scratch behind his ear, her voice warm with sincerity. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed," she whispered. He leaned into her touch, as if to say he already knew. She sat back in her chair, holding her cup of tea close, letting the warmth seep into her palms. The house around her no longer felt like a monument to loss, but a place where life could grow again, even if slowly. She knew she had choices to make. Not large ones, not life-changing at once, but small, important decisions that would guide her towards something new. The first was simple. She walked to Thomas's study once again, the morning light pouring through the window like a blessing. The letter still rested where she had placed it the night before, and she lifted it gently, holding it at her heart before tucking it inside Thomas's favorite journal, the one bound in dark brown leather with edges worn soft from his hands. It felt right, like reuniting two pieces of him that had waited too long to be whole again. As she closed the journal, she noticed something she hadn't paid attention to before, a drawer in the desk slightly ajar. Bailey's nose twitched, and he moved closer, pawing gently at the wood. She opened it and found a small wooden box, smooth and aged, with Thomas's initials carved into the lid. She hesitated, the air growing still again, but this time it wasn't the stillness of grief. It was the breathless pause of discovering yet another piece of a story she thought had ended long ago. Inside the box lay a collection of small items Thomas must have gathered through their years together. The ticket stub from their first movie date, the handwritten vows he'd scribbled on a scrap of paper before reading the polished version at their wedding, a pressed flower from the field where he proposed, and a photograph she had never seen before. Thomas, sitting at the edge of a military cot, writing something with an expression of fierce tenderness. She knew instantly he had been writing her letter. Her breath hitched, but tears didn't fall this time. Instead, she felt a blooming warmth in her chest, a steady reassurance that love hadn't been lost. It had only been waiting for the right moment to be found again. She smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in what felt like ages, and Bailey nudged her arm proudly as though he had orchestrated this discovery as well. She closed the box and held it close before tucking it under her arm and walking out of the study. Today, she decided, she would step outside, really step outside, not just to collect mail or bring Bailey for a quick walk, but to be part of the world again. Bailey seemed to understand the importance of this choice. He practically danced beside her as she put on her shoes, his joyful energy infectious enough to make her laugh softly. The morning air was crisp when she opened the front door, the scent of damp earth and fresh leaves greeting her as though the world had been saving its best breath just for her. She stepped onto the porch, feeling the wood beneath her feet, the sun warming her face, the breeze teasing her hair. Bailey trotted ahead, pausing every few steps to make sure she followed. She took in the neighborhood, the houses, the trees, the quiet hum of life she had ignored for too long, and felt a stirring sense of belonging. She walked toward the small park down the street, where she and Thomas used to sit on late afternoons just to watch people pass by. The bench they favored was still there, a bit weathered now, but sturdy. She sat down, placing the wooden box beside her. Bailey settled at her feet, his gaze sweeping the surroundings like a guardian reassured by the peaceful morning. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the sunlight soak into her skin. She felt something loosen inside her, something that had been knotted for years. She opened Thomas's box again and took out the unseen photograph. She studied it with a calm she hadn't expected. Instead of pain, she felt connection, gratitude, and the quiet certainty that moving forward didn't mean leaving him behind. It meant carrying him differently, less like a weight and more like a compass. She whispered into the breeze, "I hear you now, love. I didn't before, but I do now." A gentle wind stirred the leaves, almost as if answering. Bailey placed his paw on her shoe, grounding her once more. She looked down at him, emotion tightening her throat, and whispered, "You brought me home." The dog lifted his head and met her eyes with that unshakable loyalty only animals seem capable of giving without hesitation or condition. As she sat there, feeling the world expand around her rather than close in, she understood that healing wouldn't come all at once. It would arrive in moments like this, quiet, unassuming, but powerful enough to reshape a life, and she was finally ready to let those moments in. She placed the box gently on her lap, rested her hand on Bailey's head, and watched as the day unfolded before her. She didn't know exactly what tomorrow would hold, But for the first time in years, she was no longer afraid of it. The letter had given her closure, but Bailey had given her something far greater: permission to live again, permission to step out of the shadow of loss and into the possibility of new beginnings. And as the sun rose higher, casting warm light across the park, Margaret felt something inside her finally settle into peace. She wasn't alone. She had love in her memories, strength in her heart, and Bailey by her side, a companion who had guided her back to the world, one forgotten letter at a time.